Today, the productivity myth. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to this post covering finance and prop news with a distinctively Australian flavour. Today, in The Conversation, Peter Martin published a really important article discussing the very important subject of productivity, which frankly has gone nowhere in recent years, and unless things change, it's going to get worse. It's worth listening to what he said. Not long ago, it seemed as if the future was going to get better and better. Not long ago at all, he said. For me, the high point was around 2005. That was just 15 years ago. I don't know if you can remember how you felt at that time, but he says, for me, the surging living standards, driven by an ever-building surge in output per working hour, which of course is what productivity is, suggested things were building on themselves. Each new innovation was making use of the ones that had come before. Ray Kurzweil, now the director of research at Google, summed it up in a book released in 2005 titled The Singularity is Near. Singularity was a future period during which the pace of technological change would be so rapid, its impact so deep, that human life will be irreversibly transformed. Changes would build on each other to the point where everything changed at once. Kurzweil dubbed it as the law of accelerating returns. Year by year, in the lead up to 2005, Australia's productivity growth had accelerated to the point where in the 15 years to 2005 it had grown 37%. If in the 1930s economist John Maynard Keynes foresaw ever larger and larger classes and groups of people from whom problems of economic necessity would have practically been removed. On average, the working week might fall, he said, to 15 hours. In the 1970s, futurologist Alvin Toffler spoke of a 4-hour working day. But then, from 2005, productivity growth collapsed. In the 15 years since, Australia's output per working hour, productivity, has grown by just 17%. So that 37% turned out to be the high point. And it's not just a story in Australia. In the United States and other developed economies, productivity growth is divided into before 2005 when it was rapid and after 2005 when it collapsed. 2005 is when Apple got serious about developing the iPhone. It was when many of our technological innovations really did start building on themselves. 2005 is when things were meant to take off. In his impressive book, The Rise and Fall of American Growth, economist Robert Gordon rightly points out that things like the iPhone are nothing like as genuinely useful as the innovations in the lead up to the 1940s. Gordon says not a single urban home was wired for electricity in 1880, but by 1940 nearly 100% had mains power, 94% had clean piped water, 80% had flush toilets, and 56% had refrigerators. He says, whereas as all of us could quite happily travel back in time 60 years from today and enjoy a recognisable lifestyle, we couldn't have done it if we travelled back 60 years from the 1940s. Instead, it's as if the innovation we've had has been less useful, as if, in the words of PayPal founder Peter Thiel, we wanted flying cars, instead we got 140 characters. Or it might be that the things we do these days are harder to automate. A century ago, roughly half of the Australian workforce worked in service jobs, doing things such as hairdressing and writing reports. Today, it's 80%. Back then, 45% of us worked in farming or manufacturing. Today, it's not even 10%. Services such as hairdressing, nursing, and aged care are about as productive as they will ever be. It's possible to cut hair or consult patients faster, but what's lost is the time and personal attention spent doing it, which is part of the service. We might be reaching hard limits. So if productivity is output to service per unit of input time spent, it doesn't make sense to measure it where much of the output is the input. This is one of the reasons the Bureau of Statistics provides measures of what it calls multi-factor productivity for industries such as agriculture and mining, but not for health and social assistance, which is Australia's biggest employer. The Bureau is working on a measure of health, but it thinks it will have to use as the output changed life expectancy or surveys of patient satisfaction with their treatment. In the US, as many as 30% of workers are now in persuasive industries, including advertising, public relations, and the law. It is almost impossible to measure their output. How do you measure success in persuading people to change their minds? For public servants and writers, it is possible to measure output in terms of words produced, but deeply unhelpful. It is far from certain these workers would be more productive if they worked faster. Technology might even be sending us backwards, which is a way of saying that we might be coming up against hard limits in the amount we can squeeze out of each hour of paid work. Or perhaps not. The singularity promises us robots that can talk to dementia patients and bots that can write political news. And the application of technology might even be sending productivity backwards. British economics writer Tim Harford points out that what drove the real big advances in productivity in manufacturing was specialization. The father of capitalist economics, Adam Smith, famously observed that a pin factory employing 10 specialists could produce 48,000 pins a day. An individual who did all of those jobs working without specialized equipment could scarcely, with his utmost industry, make 1 pin in a day, and certainly could not make 20. Harford says technology is turning us into generalists. Computers have made it easier to create and circulate messages, to book travel, to design web pages, he said. Instead of increasing productivity, these tools tempt highly skilled, highly paid people to noodle around making bad slides. And there's a consequence as well for living standards. I could say worse about smartphones and the 140, now 280 characters in Twitter. They might be taking away more from our workday output than they add to it. This failure of ever-increasing amounts of technology to do anything like what was expected matters, because productivity growth is what we were counting on to drive economic growth and the ability for future generations to support increasing number of retirees. Over 4 intergenerational reports, the government has revised down its estimates of productivity growth and the size of the economy in 4 decades' time. And by the way, the next 5-yearly report is due out later this year. Now, I believe that he's onto something here, and it's really very, very important. And to give you another perspective, there's a book I turn to, which is not an economics book at all, but frankly is a very important book nevertheless, and that is Douglas Adams' The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And he makes the point in that book that more and more of society ends up in roles like advertising, executives, etc., etc. And at one point in the book, he actually makes the point that they were all sent to a distant planet many years ago and then couldn't evolve because they didn't know how to. I think he makes a very good point. And I believe that we need to think very carefully about how society works, what's important in society, and frankly, just chasing more technology for the sake of technology is not going to get us to where we need to get to. It's time for some really hard thinking, not least because if population continues to grow around the world and the demographic shifts continue, then our ability to be able to support ourselves in a generation or 2 down the track is deeply in question. And that, for me, is a very significant issue. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.